welcome to our History Highlights presentation about the Oregon Trail. Today we share with you the amazing pioneer stories that shaped American history. My name is Bill Wiemuth, and I'm here from historyhighlights.com, where we hope to share with you fascinating true stories that you can enjoy in about an hour. These are 40 to 50 page paperbacks and ebooks that you can read in about an hour, and then audiobooks and videos that you can watch in about an hour. And we've got a catalog of a lot of great stories from the pages of history, the juicy ones, the dramatic ones, the fascinating characters, the remarkable people, the significant impact that helped our country grow westward, the interesting characters along the way, the Civil War, Mark Twain. We'll travel up to Alaska and meet John Muir. All kinds of great tales, a catalog that's ever expanding at historyhighlights.com, where you can also find some podcasts and YouTube videos and blog posts. We want to help you fall in love with history for the first time or all over again at historyhighlights.com. Now, I know today you've come for the story of the Oregon Trail, and you picked a great one. And I am so proud to have a guest joining me for today's presentation. This is my lovely wife. This is Laura Sable.
Hello, everyone.
You know, in the middle of the 1800s, as the Oregon Trail experience begins to unfold, Henry David Thoreau was one of the leading authors in America at that time. And I think he really captured the spirit of the nation when he wrote this.
Eastward I go only by force, but westward I go free. This is the prevailing tendency of my countrymen. I must walk toward Oregon and not toward Europe. And then that way the nation is moving, and I may say that mankind progress from east to west.
It would be words like that that would inspire hundreds of thousands of pioneers to make a 2,200-mile journey across the continent in hopes of a new life. Before we follow along with why they went and where they went and how in the world they did this, a little bit of background to help you understand. And this also weaves in some of my other ebooks and presentations. The fascinating story of the Louisiana Purchase, as our country doubled in size and our western border went from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains. As a result of that, we sent Lewis and Clark out to explore that region and to continue all the way on to the Pacific Ocean. And I do have several installments of Lewis and Clark, following them west, and then another for their journey back east as they divided into several expeditions, and also a wrap up of what happens to the expedition members afterwards. Now, only 4 years after Lewis and Clark's expedition, the writings they have recorded about the resources in the Pacific Northwest, primarily fur-bearing animals, they persuaded a fur tycoon named John Jacob Astor to try and get in on this. And we called the group that he put together the Astorians. He funded an expedition to travel across the continent, follow Lewis and Clark's trail, although they don't, and a ship to go down around South America, all to meet at the mouth of the Columbia River at the Pacific Ocean to start a fur trading post. Now, everything went wrong. Boy, everything goes wrong. A couple of the biggest are that their ship is destroyed, they're left stranded, and they have some major violence with the Native Americans, and a big part of their group is killed. So they ask one of the members of the expedition, his name is Robert Stewart, to lead a group from the mouth of the Columbia River across North America back to New York City to report into John Jacob Astor. Along the way, the Native Americans introduce him to a new route through the Rocky Mountains we now call South Pass, which is in today's Wyoming. It's only about 7,500 feet elevation, a broad, wide valley, easy for wagons and horses to cross across the Continental Divide, and he'll discover that going east, back to report into Astor. He travels down the Platte River, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, back down to St. Louis, eventually all the way back to New York to meet with Astor. And he's the first coming back to the east now to learn that for almost a year, the United States and Great Britain have been at war, the War of 1812. And during that war, British troops and ships all will meet at the mouth of the Columbia River and threaten that Fort Astoria, and they actually convinced the members of the Astorian expedition to sell John Jacob Astor's fort right out from under him, and the Northwest Company and eventually Hudson's Bay Company will take that over and operate it for the rest of the next part of the 1800s. Now, right after the War of 1812, both the United States and Great Britain in 1818 signed the Oregon Treaty. Now, up until this point, Spain, Russia, Great Britain, United States have all been exploring and competing for claim to the Pacific Northwest. And now we will narrow it down eventually to Great Britain and the U.S. Russia and Spain sign away their claim. And these two countries agreed now, the United States and Great Britain, to co-own, to share claim to this Oregon territory because they both wanted to develop it for the fur trading enterprise. This opens it up to everybody, and it's also going to make sure that everybody knows that the Hudson's Bay Company moves in. They become the dominant force all throughout the middle of the early part of the 1800s, and that's the background where our story dives in. And really, that area could well have stayed in British hands if not for the pioneers in our story today. So why in the world are they going west? Well, they want to experience the Pacific Northwest and what it has to offer, this great paradise that they keep hearing about. Because of an economic crash that takes place in North America in 1837, the United States economy collapses. For the next several years, people endured bank closures and record unemployment. Many had their farms and homes repossessed, and so they just loaded up what they had left and they turned and headed to where they keep hearing is heaven on earth, out to the Pacific Northwest. Now, one of the pioneers on that journey was a man named Jesse Quinn Thornton. And he was inspired to go, like many others, because of passages written by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Matter of fact, I'll take you back to Lewis and Clark in 1806 as they are returning back across the continent. Lewis writes about the area in the Pacific Northwest between the Cascade Mountains and the coastal mountains, what we now call the Willamette River Valley, where Portland, Oregon, that area is today. And Meriwether Lewis described that beautiful region and that slice of heaven in the Pacific Northwest with this entry.
This valley is indeed the only desirable situation for a settlement which I have seen on the west side of the Rocky Mountains.
Yes, that was the place to go. And as that gets shared and publicized and reprinted year by year, decade by decade, the Willamette River Valley becomes the destination that these folks are headed on. But why in the world would they go? Economic struggles, now an opportunity to try and reform their lives and to start fresh. But they've got an incredible journey ahead, and there's all kinds of people gathering on these journeys. Some of the wagon trains were over 1,000 people at a time. One of the immigrants named Jesse Quinn Thornton in 1846, I thought described why people were going pretty well when he wrote this.
Many were removing to Oregon with the hope of obtaining from the government of the United States a grant of land which would enable them to maintain their families in honorable independence. Some, having sold their property to pay their creditors, could not consent to remain where they must necessarily see their former pleasant homes in other hands. Others had their yearly acquisitions taken from them by eager creditors who had thus crippled their resources, depressed their energies, and deprived them of all hope of either paying their debts or of being able to educate their children. Some were actuated by mere love of change, many more by a spirit of enterprise and adventure, and a few, I believe, knew not exactly why they were thus upon the road. With these reasons were more or less mixed up as a very important element, a desire to occupy the country as a basis of title in the dispute between the government of the United States and that of Great Britain.
So there were lots of motivations that pushed people westward, even patriotism and a chance at increasing our claim to the Pacific Northwest in our contest with Britain out there. So people began to make their way bit by bit to the St. Louis area. They'd move up the Missouri River for as far as they could. 1839 was the first group of 18 men from Peoria, Illinois, who hired fur traders to guide them out through, made it all the way to the Willamette River Valley, traveled back to get more. The wagon trains grow year by year. As I mentioned, by 1843, over 1,000 immigrants left that year, headed on the Oregon Trail. And Jesse Applegate was an immigrant that year in 1843, and he wrote this.
No other race of men with the means at their command would undertake so great a journey. None save these could successfully perform it with no previous preparation, relying only on the fertility of their own invention to devise the means to overcome each danger and difficulty as it arose. They have undertaken to perform with slow-moving oxen a journey of 2,000 miles. The way lies over trackless wastes, wide and deep rivers, ragged and lofty mountains.
They would travel, if they could, by steamboat to St. Louis. From there, they're going to proceed up the Missouri River to a place called Independence Landing. And there they will prepare and gather their supplies and get ready for their journey across the continent. Now, in 1847, Joel Palmer published a traveler's guide to help pioneers decide what they should pack and what they should take along the journey. And he wrote that for each adult they should take,
here we go, 200 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of pilot bread, 75 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of rice, 5 pounds of coffee, 2 pounds of tea, 25 pounds of sugar, half a bushel of dried beans, 1 bushel of dried fruit, 2 pounds of baking soda, 10 pounds of salt, half a bushel of cornmeal, and it is well to have half a bushel of corn parched and ground. A small keg of vinegar should also be taken.
Man, I imagine that's just for starters. And now keep in mind, they're going to have to take supplies to last them for 4.5, 5 months of traveling with hardly any access to supplies along the way other than hunting wild game. How to carry all of this stuff was another struggle. First off, they began thinking about the Conestoga wagons, but they quickly realized they were way too big and way too heavy, climbing the elevation up and over the Rocky Mountains. So they scaled them down to a smaller version that get nicknamed prairie schooners. They look like little ships traveling across the continent, and maybe you could make 15 miles in a day if you were really doing well. One pioneer, Peter Burnett, wrote this: "Having your wagons well prepared, they are as secure as a house. Beware of heavy wagons, for they will break down your teams for no purpose, and you will not need them. The ox is a most noble animal, patient, thrifty, durable, gentle, and does not run off. Those who come to this country will be in love with their oxen. The ox will plunge through mud, swim over streams, dive into thickets, and he will eat almost anything."
Wow, sounds like a teenage boy.
It does. There's a lot of comparisons there.
Yeah, really.
So at Independence, that's as far as boats are traveling at this point, up the Missouri River. That's where everybody gathered and prepared for the journey westward. They're going to start out in the beautiful springtime to make sure they can get up and over the Rockies before the snows will lock them in. And these groups of wagons will gather together to travel in units for protection and for support. If you have not already said goodbye to relatives that are not making the journey, this is the time. And here's Martha G. Masterson.
Lovers, sweethearts, and associates were all left behind. The saddest parting of all was when my mother took leave of her aged and sorrowing mother, knowing full well that they would never meet again on earth.
At least leaving in the springtime across the plains, it was absolutely beautiful. Here's Elizabeth Keegan in 1852.
The first part of the route is beautiful, and the scenery surpassing anything of a kind I have ever seen. Large rolling prairies stretching as far as the eye can carry you, the grass so green, and flowers of every description.
These folks are going to face every kind of challenge you can imagine, from the terrain to the weather to dangers and inconveniences and discomforts. And it apparently began just about on day one of the journey. I want you to imagine hundreds of wagons rolling along in a line. Elizabeth Dixon Smith in 1847.
You in the States know nothing of dust. It will fly so that you can hardly see the horns of your oxen. It often seems like the cattle must die for want of breath. And then in our wagons, such a spectacle. Beds, clothes, and children completely covered.
Oh, man, what a mess this must have been. The first destination they're kind of aiming for is a military post, which wasn't built until 1848. It was established simply to protect and to help supply these immigrant wagon trains. The pioneers could stop and purchase food supplies there. Nearly everyone took advantage of the fort's reliable mail service, and then heading across Nebraska as we know it today, they would struggle through that springtime primarily with challenges in the weather. Here's Francis Parkman in 1847.
The distant mountains frowned more gloomily. There was a low muttering of thunder, and dense black masses of cloud rose heavily behind the broken peaks. Soon the thick blackness overspread the whole sky, and the desert around us was wrapped in a deep gloom. The storm broke. It came upon us with a zigzag, blinding flash, with a terrific crash of thunder, and with a hurricane that howled over the prairie, dashing floods of water against us.
They are now moving into what is now western Nebraska, and they begin to see some really interesting rock formations that will get names based upon what they reminded them of. And I think once you see these pictures, it makes a lot of sense. Courthouse and jail rocks in Nebraska. This one easily would be Chimney Rock, and sometimes they get named specifically after early explorers like Scott's Bluff here in Nebraska as well. I think that Thomas Easton described this region when he wrote this. How can I describe the scene that now bursts upon us? Tower, bastion, dome, and battlement vie in all their majesty before us. A more beautiful and majestic scene cannot be conceived. That's another reason why I love working in the writings of these pioneers, not only to share with you from a first-person perspective of what the people on the journey experienced, but also because they were often beautiful writers, and I love getting to read these entries. Now, the elevation as we move westward begins to increase. We're climbing towards the Rocky Mountains, and the oxen are growing tired. And that wagon is feeling heavier and heavier, and anything in the wagon that was not absolutely necessary went overboard. And the trail here apparently was lined with big armoires and big bed frames and grandfather clocks, just tossed overboard. And we get a description of this phenomenon from Father Pierre Desmond.
The numerous shattered fragments of vehicles, provisions, tools, etc., intended to be taken across these wild plains, tell us another tale of reckless boldness with which many entered up this hazardous enterprise.
Overboard it went. I've even read accounts of entrepreneurs in St. Louis that would follow this far up to collect all the goods and bring them back and sell in St. Louis. The next place they're hoping to get to is Fort Laramie in what is now Wyoming. This is kind of the gateway to the Rockies. This is the first civilization the pioneers have seen in 6 weeks. The fort had begun as a log fort back in 1834. It was built by a fur trapper named William Sublette. It became a fur trading post in 1836, but the United States Army took it over in the 1840s, again to try and serve and help these immigrant trains moving westward. Colonel William Thompson writes, "At Fort Laramie, we crossed the Platte River by fording, and the stream, as I remember it, was near a mile wide, but not waist deep. 30 and 40 oxen were hitched to one wagon to effect the crossing, but woe to the hapless team that stalled in the treacherous quicksands." Crossing rivers was some of the most dangerous part of the journey for the Oregon Trail pioneers. Eventually, entrepreneurs will set up a ferry and charge a toll, but most of the time, they were just on their own to try and ford or fill the cracks of their wagon with clay or mud and float them across, and as you can imagine, oftentimes tragedy ensued. Martha Hill Gillette in 1853.
In crossing, great care must be taken in the selection of a place, and if possible, to cross where there was shoal, for then the river would be wider but not so deep. To get our things across, every wagon had to be taken apart and all the things unpacked and repacked. But through it all, I heard not a word of grumbling.
Moving further now into Wyoming, we get some other interesting landmarks. Soft sandstone formations known as Register Cliff and another known as Independence Rock. You hoped to get there by the 4th of July. You knew you were on track. And because of that soft sandstone, the pioneers couldn't resist. And those bluffs are covered with hundreds of names of pioneers that etched their existence into the sandstone. I was here, I made this trip. John Fremont wrote, "We encamped 1 mile below Rock Independence. This is an isolated rock about 650 yards long and 40 in height, and everywhere where the surface is sufficiently smooth, the rock is inscribed with the names of travelers." And those names represent often multi-generations. These are family units, grandparents, parents, kids, all 3 generations traveling together. And those inscriptions, I think, are haunting remnants of these brave travelers, these families, these mothers, these fathers, these children. And many of the children also kept their own journals and diaries along the way. Martha Ann Morrison was only 13 years old when she made the trip. Here's one of her entries.
Mothers had the families directly in their hands and were with them all the time, especially during sickness. I remember one girl in particular, about my own age, that died and was buried on the road. Her mother had a great deal of trouble and suffering. Mothers on the trail had to undergo more trial and suffering than anyone else.
I think perhaps women especially are finding their family role greatly expanded here on the Oregon Trail as their responsibilities really are changing. Helen M. Carpenter gives us an account.
In respect to women's work, the days are all the same, except for when we stop. Then there is washing to be done and light bread to make and all kinds of odd jobs. Some women have very little help about the camp, being obliged to get the wood and water, make the campfires, unpack at night and pack up in the morning. I am lucky in having a Yankee husband, and so I am well waited on.
Well, good job, Yankee husbands, for taking such good care of those lovely ladies.
Yes.
They finally reach now in Wyoming an important landmark and a dramatic one, and it gets a dramatic name. It's known as Devil's Gate. This again is soft sandstone here, and the Sweetwater River over the course of time has cut a path down through that rock. Now it's 400 feet wide across at the top, but down at the bottom only 30 feet across, and they snake through this narrow opening right along that little creek. This is their access over to South Pass that I mentioned. Remember, the Continental Divide crossing discovered by the Astorians coming back east to report to John Jacob Astor, that will be the trail used now for every traveler going west. It's across that 7,550-foot elevation crossing of the Continental Divide. So finally, across through South Pass, they begin to make their journey up and over. Now you'll notice South Pass is barren. There is not a tree in sight. And the hunting is a little difficult. The first thing they would do every night is they would gather the wagons into a circle to create a corral for the animals, and they would start hunting, or they would start trying to gather fuel to get a fire going. Not a tree or stick in sight to get a fire going here in this high elevation. But luckily, Joseph Goldsboro Bruff remarks for us that they were assisted by the buffalo.
It is the duty of the cooks upon arriving at the camping place to collect chips for cooking, buffalo chips. It would amuse friends back home to see them make a grand rush for the largest and driest chips. The chips burn well when they're dry, but if they're damp or wet, they're smoky and almost fireproof.
Can you imagine what those campfires must have smelled like? That whole camp must have smelled like. Goodness gracious. And the food is monotonous. They're living on hardtack and just basics. Hunting is often scarce in this region. Matter of fact, Clark Thompson in this area in 1850 wrote, "I looked starvation in the face. I have seen men on passing an animal that has starved to death on the plains stop, cut out a steak, roast and eat it, and call it delicious." You got to be pretty hungry, that's for sure. Here in Wyoming now, we reach another important spot, known then and now as the Parting of the Ways. And a couple of things about this slide here you'll notice. First off, the ruts from these Oregon Trail pioneers were so deeply eroded year by year, decade after decade, they are still visible through much of the part of this journey. And here you can tell they split in two different directions. This is the spot where you got to decide. Are you continuing on the right-hand trail to go a little further north up to the Oregon country, to the Willamette River Valley, or do you want to turn left and veer a little further south and go over through the Sierras and all the way down to California? It was a big decision, and many of the large wagon trains will divide here. I've even read about large family groups traveling together that divided here as a way to diversify risk. Hopefully one group or the other of us will make it along the way, and so there were often some hard farewells that took place here. The next spot they're hoping to reach is Fort Bridger, there on the edge of Wyoming, and this was built by one of the early great fur trappers. His name was Jim Bridger, and he built this fort in 1843 to help supply the travelers. He would later write, "I have established a small fort with a blacksmith shop and iron in the road of the immigrants, and by the time they get there, they are in want of all kinds of supplies." And Jim Bridger would make a fortune off of that and his fur trading enterprises. One of the biggest fears we note in the journals of the pioneers was one that very rarely ever came to fruition, and that was a fear of the Native Americans of the West. They had very little information about what to expect, but there was very little violence along the trail in those early years. As a matter of fact, natives often served as guides for these groups along the way, and they were great trading partners also along the journey. John Minto in 1844,
"To complete our satisfaction, a cavalcade of Indian women now came along with horses loaded with camas roots. We purchased some fresh roots to boil with our game. We bought all the women had, fish hooks being our money."
You know, day after day, this journey is so physically fatiguing. 12 to 15 miles was a good average, and you went every day. There was no stopping. Otherwise, you get caught by the snows, and you needed to get on down to civilization over in the Willamette River Valley. The physical exhaustion must have just been mind-boggling. And remember, those wagons are there to carry the supplies. These people are walking 2,200 miles on average across North America for this journey. Benjamin Cleaver in 1848 wrote, "A drowsiness has fallen apparently on man and beast. Teamsters fall asleep on their perches and even when walking beside their teams." Here's Elizabeth Dixon Smith in 1847.
"My children gave out with cold and fatigue and could not travel, and the boys had to unhitch the oxen and bring them and carry the children on to camp. We started this morning at sunrise and did not get to camp until after dark, and there was not one dry thread on one of us, not even my babe, and I was so fatigued that I could hardly speak or step."
This physical exhaustion begins to break down their immune systems, making them more susceptible to sickness and disease, also more susceptible to accidents along the way. And this is a stretch of the journey where tragedy often unfolded. Absalom Hardin in 1847 wrote this, "Mr. Harvey's young little boy Richard, 8 years old, went to get in the wagon and fell. And the wheels ran over him and he never moved." Cholera is breaking out all along the trail, and it would claim thousands of lives. Here's a theory from Jane D. Kellogg in 1852.
"There was an epidemic of cholera. Think it was caused from drinking water from the holes dug by campers. All along was a graveyard. Most any time of day you could see people burying their dead. Some places 5 and 6 graves in a row."
There is a wonderful organization, a nonprofit group called the Oregon and California Trails Association, OCTA. That's their website. It's a great website with lots of information. They have studied through hundreds and hundreds of different journals and great research. Their estimate is that 1 out of 10 along the Oregon Trail would perish along the journey. They estimated that in about a 25-year period, The death toll may have exceeded more than 60,000 deaths along a 2,000-mile journey. That means an average of about 30 graves per mile for over 2,000 miles. These people really had to want to go to the Northwest. They were literally risking everything. Because of this kind of situation, this loss, this struggle, they were so excited to see one more spot of civilization. It was a fort in modern-day Idaho called Fort Hall. It had been established by a man named Nathaniel Wiemuth way back in 1834 as he tried to compete with the Hudson's Bay Company, and they just lowered prices until they could drive him out of business. He finally would give that up, and now it becomes a settlement to help supply these travelers along the journey. I think all of this struggle and sickness and death must have certainly led to a lot of doubt and a lot of questioning the decisions that they've made. A great account of that comes from Lavinia Porter.
I would make a brave face, a brave effort to be cheerful and patient until the camp work was done. Then starting out, when I thought I had gone beyond hearing distance, I would throw myself down on the unfriendly desert and give way like a child to sobs and tears, wishing myself back home with my friends and chiding myself for consenting to take this wild goose chase.
For much of this stretch of the journey, they are following along the Snake River. And they would occasionally have difficult choices to make, like here at the Three Island Crossing in modern-day Idaho. You see, if you followed the Snake River around its long, curving bends, it was a lot longer journey than if you risked making it step by step, island to island, over to the other side. You could get a significant shortcut that would take you on a more direct route across over to Fort Boise. Some followed the south side of the river around that long bend of the Snake River, but hopefully that would eventually bring you back to another little pit stop where you could catch your break, get a little bit of supplies, and reorganize. But you had to keep moving. You needed to, because still ahead was the beautiful but formidable Blue Mountains. This is on the eastern edge of Oregon and Washington today, and John Minto in 1844 wrote, "The sight from this mountaintop is one to be remembered while life lasts. Looking across this grand valley westward, the dark blue line of the Cascade Range of mountains appears a forest-clad and impassable wall, out of which arise two immense white cones, called, as I subsequently learned, Mount Hood and Mount Adams." They're getting close. And finally, they will descend out of the Blue Mountains down towards the banks of the Columbia River. They're in the last home stretch. They can see the mountains off in the distance. They follow along the river banks as best they could. And finally, along the banks of the Columbia River, Esther G. McMillan Hanna in 1852 wrote this.
Came out in an open prairie. The scenery is very beautiful. Had a superb view of the Cascade Mountains. To the west, Mount Hood, the loftiest of these, was very visible, and being covered with snow with the sun shining upon it, it looked like a golden cloud in the distance, being 150 miles away. I never enjoyed so rich a sight before.
Following down the Columbia River, they move into the Cascade Mountains, and the river cutting through that with the steep bluffs on each side finally dead ends, so to speak, at least for the wagons, at a place that will become known as the Dalles. Here in the slide, you can see these large basalt lava rock formations in the Columbia River that funneled the river into white foaming rapids. And to the French that would come along, they thought these looked like stepping stones, like a great giant could step from one side of the river to the other. And so a dalle is a stepping stone in French. So this was the Dalles, the stepping stones. And that's now a town called the Dalles, Oregon, right along the Columbia River Gorge. And here the edge of the river met the steep bluffs of the canyons with no access for wagons to continue. To try and go up and around Mount Hood was far too rough, no way for a wagon to go. So they would maybe try and drive the cattle, the oxen, across through the mountain range, but all of the supplies and people would be loaded onto rafts. They would build these or purchase these rafts here at the Dalles and load the wagons and everything they own and everyone they love to ride now down the last stretch of the Columbia River to get to the Willamette River Valley. But it's also through a ferocious area full of big whitewater rapids. And here was, in the last stretch, some of the most dangerous part of the journey. John C. Fremont in 1843 wrote this.
The river forms the Cascades and breaking over a point of masses of rocks. We again embarked, the water being white with foam among ugly rocks and boiling into 1,000 whirlpools. The boat passed with great rapidity through 2 miles of broken water. We ran some wild-looking rapids.
The Applegate family made this journey in 1843. Here's Jesse Applegate. Presently, the boat began to rise and fall and rock from side to side, and I began to think this was no ordinary rapid. When looking across the river, I saw a smaller boat about opposite to us near the south bank, and there was suddenly a wail of anguish, a shriek, and a scene of confusion in our boat that no language can describe. The boat we were watching disappeared, and we saw the men and boys struggling in the water. Father and Uncle Jesse, seeing their children drowning, were seized with a frenzy, and dropping their oars, sprang up from their seats and were about to leap from the boat to make a desperate attempt to swim to them when Mother and Aunt Cynthia, in voices that were distinctly heard above the roar of the rushing waters, by commands and entreaties, brought them to a realization of our own perilous situation and the madness of an attempt to reach the other side of the river by swimming. Lindsay Applegate.
My son, 10 years old, and my brother Jesse's son Edward, same age, were lost. It was a painful scene beyond description. We dared not go to the assistance without exposing the occupants of the other boat to certain destruction. The bodies of the drowned were never recovered. The water is wide, I cannot cross o'er, and neither have I wings to fly. Build me a boat that can carry two, and both shall row, my love and I. When you think about these pioneers and you wonder what kept them going through the pain and the discomfort and the loss, and one word just leaps to mind to me, and that was hope. And you read it in their journals, their writings, that they had hope. Here's one great quote from Catherine Sager. Surely if the way of the pioneer is hard and beset with dangers, at least the long years bring at last the realization that life patiently and hopefully lived brings its own sense of having been a part of the onward move to better things, not for self alone, but for others. Our love shines clear against the storm, turns darkest night to brightest day, turns stormy seas to a perfect calm, a blazing lamp to light our way.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. You know, because of disasters that would happen to families like the Applegates, a man by the name of Samuel Barlow in 1845 led a small party with 13 wagons from the Dalles on a southwest loop up and around Mount Hood. The next year, he went to the Oregon Provisional Legislature and he convinced them to authorize him, at his own expense, to take a group of 40 men and to carve out a trail that they had scouted up and around the edge of Mount Hood, 80 miles up and around, that would descend down into the Willamette River Valley. It was a treacherous journey on its own, very steep, very rocky. Sometimes they had to lower wagons down by a rope around a tree like a counterweight, broken axles, broken wheels, broken legs, disaster at every turn. But it was much less risky than going up and around Mount Hood than it was to try and shoot the rapids down through the Columbia. And by the mid-1850s, most immigrants were glad to pay the outrageous $5 toll to use Barlow's Road. One way or another, by river or by the mountain pass, they would hopefully descend into the Willamette River Valley to the small town that was beginning to grow up there called Oregon City. Oregon City, there in the heart of the Willamette River Valley, was the spot that Meriwether Lewis had promoted as the best place for settlement, and it grew rapidly. And Loren Hastings, when he arrived, wrote, "I look back upon the long, dangerous, and precarious immigrant road with a degree of romance and pleasure, but to others, it is the graveyard of their friends." Henry Garrison.
Our journey is ended. Our toils are over, but I have not tried to portray the terrible conditions we were placed in. No tongue can tell, nor pen describe the heart-rending scenes through which we passed.
James Miller. We were happy after a long and tedious tour to witness the home of civilization, to see mills, storehouses, shops, to hear the noise of the workman's hammer, to enjoy the warm welcome of countrymen and friends. Because of these Oregon Trail pioneers flooding in year after year, the Willamette River Valley began to grow exponentially, and it is theorized that in the coming decades, over 300,000 people would make that journey all the way to the Oregon country. As a result of which, the Hudson's Bay Company, which has now barricaded themselves in a fort on the north side of the Columbia River called Fort Vancouver, just opposite from the mouth of the Willamette River, tried to convince all of the American settlers to settle on the south side of the Columbia River, hoping that if there was a dispute, Britain could have the Columbia River as their border, with everything to the north retained by Britain. They tried that for a while, but finally by 1848, the Oregon Territory gets organized. In 1846, though, 2 years before that, Britain had signed off on the treaty. For 28 years, Britain and the United States cohabitated, shared title to this land. 1846, Britain gives up their claim. The United States has it exclusively, and that happens, folks, only because the mass amount of Americans that simply flooded into that region and made it their own. Just a few more things to put on your timeline. The West Coast gets a big boost in 1849 as there's a gold rush in California. To support the northern region, Congress offered the 1850 Oregon Donation Land Act. Come to Oregon, stake your claim, you and your wife, stay for 5 years, build a shelter, farm a little bit, and after 5 years, 1 square mile yours, free of charge. Not a bad deal, that's for sure. 1853, so many people in Oregon area, at the Columbia River, they broke the northern region off to become its own Washington territory. And with over 300,000 population by 1859, as the 33rd state, Oregon joined the Union. 10 years later, the West Coast got another big bonus as the train connects all the way across North America, all the way to the West Coast. But pioneers continued to still use the Oregon Trail all the way to the end of the 1800s if they didn't have the money for the train fare. And it'll be 20 years after the train comes in 1889, and then the following year in 1890, that Washington and Idaho finally joined the Union as well. That's right. We live in Idaho, so we're always cheering for the Pacific Northwest. These Oregon Trail pioneers on their incredible 2,200-mile journey changed the history of this country. Now, I wanted to wrap all of this up with some type of a personal illustration. And I think I finally found it. Why people went, what an impact it made in their lives, I think is beautifully told by this man. His name is James Addison Bushnell, and I want to share with you briefly his incredible story. In the spring of 1852, living in Missouri, he decided that journeying to Oregon was the way of the future. So in the spring of that year, he left his family behind on their farm. Said, "I'll go get everything started. I'll send for you when things are good." So by fall of 1852, he's up in Oregon. He hears about gold still being discovered down in California. He relocates down to California, has some success, goes back to Oregon, writes to his wife and mother to bring the family and to come out. And months passed, and he never heard from them. He never saw them, and he knew that the mail service was notoriously unreliable, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. In July of 1853, he caught a ship down to San Francisco and eventually all the way down to Central America. He's got his $400 that he's made on his gold. That was a lot of money. Down at Central America, he stops at Panama. There's no canal there yet. He unloads and crosses the isthmus on that difficult portage in canoes and on burros and donkeys up and over, and finally makes it over to the Atlantic Ocean side. He catches a ship that takes him eventually all the way back to the New England area. There, he finally caught a train that took him to Chicago, a steamboat down the Illinois River, a steamboat up the Mississippi River to St. Louis. He got on a stagecoach back across Missouri. Finally, when it wouldn't take him any further, he got out and walked the rest of the way across Missouri to his family farm, to find that his wife and family had departed on the Oregon Trail months earlier. He had traveled over 15,000 miles. So he turned around and he did it all over again. He returned back to New York. He sailed down to Panama, over the isthmus, sailed back to San Francisco, got another boat back to Oregon City. He reached the Willamette River Valley, absolutely broke, and he searches until November of 1853 when he finally is reunited with his family. They had been apart for 20 months, and he has crossed the continent 3 times in so doing. After these adventures, they got away from the crowds and moved a little further south to a new little town called Eugene, Oregon, and there he raised his family. He was one of the founders in 1895 of the Eugene Divinity School, which is still in existence today as Northwest Christian College. He was president of its Board of Regents until his death. Late in his life, he wrote just a small little autobiography that beautifully illustrates the rewards of having braved the Oregon Trail. He wrote, "Today is my birthday and still finds me on the shores of time. Some of the children had planned a surprise for me in the shape of a gathering of the children and relatives and some of the old pioneers who were my friends and associates in earlier years. A table was set under the trees in the yard and loaded down with good things to eat, to which about 30 sat down and enjoyed it to the fill. Another year has gone to join the many past. All its joy, and I've had my share of them, and all its sorrow, and it seems as if I've had more than my share of them, they lie buried in the past. In the future lie the few months or years, I know not how few, God knows there can't be many, but I know I am in his care. I am nearly 84, and with loving children and kind friends, and with all this world's goods, and more than I can use, with good health, the future stretches before me like the going down of the sun on a summer's day." That is why people made this incredible journey and risked their lives to start again, to begin a new life for themselves and their family, to create a new environment and a new place and a new future for themselves and the generations that would follow. These Oregon Trail pioneers made such an impact, not only on their own lives, but on the growth and the development of the United States of America as well. You, of course, can always read more about this in my ebooks and audiobooks. I do always like to stop for a moment and thank the wonderful research assistants and librarians and park rangers that have shared so much information with me to help me comprehend this story, especially our local folks along the Columbia River at the Maritime Museum, the Clatsop County Historical Society, the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center, and so many more. I'm grateful to be able to share these incredible tales. They are available in paperback and in ebook and in audiobooks, and of course these videos, a whole collection to choose from. Come on over to historyhighlights.com for more stories, for podcasts, for YouTube videos, and for all kinds of blog posts. I am very thankful to Laura for joining me today. Appreciate you being here and sharing all of the wonderful entries. And I hope soon you will come over and join us for a great visit at historyhighlights.com. Thank you very much.